Okay. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for those who are watching live. I also welcome those who will be watching this live lecture later, inshallah. And also, let's praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all the favors that He has bestowed us with. And although the CMCO has not been lifted as hoped, but some restrictions have been relaxed. Now one can travel between districts and also between states as long as one is not in an area under emergency movement control order. So I hope that everyone is coping well, and please stay safe and also stay sane. If you have issues, any problems, please do. Okay, so today, inshallah, we will move on to the topic of hadith of sanad and matan. If I'm not mistaken, last week we looked at the verification of a matan, the verification of matan. So we looked at various aspects such as paraphrasing hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We looked at the issue of contradictory hadiths. We also looked at the topic of sabab urud al hadith, and also we looked at interpolation, inversion, and also distortion of hadith text. So today, generally, we will look into the issue of verification of sanad and matan, which falls under the umbrella of hadith criticism. Okay, so let's move on to the slides. Inshallah, this lecture will be slides. However, the significance of hadith criticism and also the efforts which were undertook by scholars, by earlier scholars, and also some criticisms of hadith criticism itself by Orientalists, which we should be. There are certain issues which the Orientalists have raised and continue to raise, which actually can easily be answered or refuted. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on. Let me share the slides. Okay. So basically today we're going to look at the meaning of takhrij. What does takhrij mean? So literally it basically means hadith retracement, while naqd means critical analysis of hadith. Yeah. So I'm sure some of you might be familiar with this term, especially takhrij, in which one would trace the sources of the hadith. Okay. Secondly, we will look at how one should properly cite hadith in publication and social media, meaning how one should cite hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and ways of doing so. But we will present to you the ideal way of citing hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then we will look at perspective of isnad and matan criticism. Then only we will look at the modern or occidental perspective of hadith criticism. So basically, these are the four subtopics which we shall cover in this live lecture, inshallah. And we will discuss also, there'll be chances for us to do some practice, inshallah, in our meeting on Wednesday, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So when it comes to takhrij and naqd al-hadith, there are several references, especially when it comes to takhrij, to retrace hadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And these are the the three types of references which one would find. Firstly, we have that which is known as al-masadir al-asliya, the fundamental sources. The fundamental sources, whereby the Muslim provides a sanad from him to the original source. For example, we have Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, Sunan al-Tirmidhi. So these hadith scholars present their own sanad. They present their own sanad of the hadith, which then reaches the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And these are considered to be fundamental. So the compiler of that hadith has his or her own sanad. Yeah, has his or her own sanad. And then we have what is known as al-masadir al-asliya, semi-fundamental sources, in which the author presented the hadith with the sanad of the Muslim whose work was considered as a fundamental source. An example would be Riyadh al-Salihin, which basically hadith compiled by Imam al-Nawawi, in which he cites hadith which can be found in Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, yeah, etc. So basically here, Imam al-Nawawi, he cites hadith as it is found in the fundamental sources. So this is known as al-masadir shibhul asliyah. And then finally we have al-masadir ghayr asliyah, non-fundamental sources, whereby the author cited from the fundamental sources, but removed the sanad of the musnid. Yeah. So in this case, the sanad is being removed. Yeah. In masadir shibhul asliyah, the sanad remains, even though the sanad is not owned. I won't say owned. The sanad is not. It's not the sanad of the compiler, but he basically cites the hadith and mentions the sanad of the fundamental source. As for masadir al-ghayr asliyah, they might make reference, yeah, to the fundamental source or to the even semi-fundamental source, but they do not include the sanad. Yeah, it's just merely making some reference to a hadith which can be found without mentioning the sanad. So basically, takhrij is retracing the sanad for a certain text. Yeah, basically tracing the sanad for a certain text. Yeah, so that is basically takhrij. Yeah, so it's basically retracing a hadith attributed to a certain hadith reference. Yani identifying the book and the chapter for the hadith. Yeah, basically verifying the sources. Where can this hadith be found? And its sanad together with the sanad. Yeah. Or retracing the place of a hadith in the masadir al-asliyah, analyzing the sanad and matn, specifying the status of the hadith according to the huffaz or hadith scholars, or evaluating the status of the hadith based on ijtihad. Yeah, this is another level of tahrij in which one then would not only retrace the place of the hadith in the fundamental sources, but one would also analyze the sanad and the matan, specifying the status of the hadith, yani the grading of the hadith according to the grading which has been set by hadith scholars, or he himself or the person himself evaluates the status of the hadith based on his analysis, based on his ijtihad. So that is another level of takhrij al-hadith. So takhrij here does not only mean looking for the sanad and tracing back the fundamental source where we can find the hadith, but it could also include analysis to determine the status of that hadith, either through quoting what other scholars have said about the status of the hadith, or he himself exercises his own ijtihad, and in analyzing the hadith, whether the sanad or the matan, then comes up with a conclusion about the status or the grading of that hadith. So examples from the classical period we can find. This is an example, Al-Talkhis Al-Habir fi Takhrij Ahadith Al-Sharh Al-Kabir. So Al-Sharh Al-Kabir was authored by Imam Al-Rafi'i, Imam Al-Rafi'i. And what did Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani did in Al-Talkhis Al-Khabir was to trace the hadith which was found in Al-Sharh Al-Kabir, yeah. So basically to look for the sanads, yeah, and to trace where this hadith actually can be found in the fundamental sources. So Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani was one of the scholars who did this, yeah, who did takhrij of hadith, and in this case he did the takhrij of the hadith found in Al-Sharh Al-Kabir. From the modern period, we can find individuals, organizations, governments also embarking on this effort of tahrij al-hadith, yeah, whereby in non-fundamental sources there might be hadith here and there, and as such, there needs to be an effort to retrace the hadith which is found in those sources, yeah, and also to evaluate the soundness of such hadith. And even in academia, the takhrij is considered to be part and parcel of the studies of hadith, and some even can obtain their PhD just, I won't say just, but through takhrij al hadith, which actually is yani, I mean, some people would view it as trivial, but actually it involves great analysis, and yes, one would deserve recognition for embarking on such efforts. Yeah, it is not merely quoting hadith from here and from the sources, or just googling on the internet to look for the sanad, but it involves more than that. It's deeper than that, in which an analyst is also expected to analyze the sanad and the matn critically to evaluate the status of the hadith in question. In Malaysia, for example, there are also certain efforts to ensure that forged hadith are not being used by preachers, yeah, in their charamas, yeah, in their talks, and this is a commendable effort by the government, on the part of the government, to ensure that when it comes to religious or Islamic teachings, that they are preserved, and that forged hadith do not infiltrate such lessons, classes, yeah, which the public attend. So these are some of the efforts using certain acts, yeah, certain laws to curb the spread of forged hadith, yeah. As for naqd, which is basically a critical analysis of the hadith, yeah, it is in a way related to takhrij as well. It is basically applying ilm al-ruwat and also ilm al-jarh wa ta'dil, yeah, to critically analyze the hadith. We've already looked at ilm al-ruwat, yeah, basically identifying the rawi, identifying the transmitters of hadith, and we looked at various genres of books related to ilm al-ruwat, yeah. We have the books on the date of birth and the date of death of transmitters. Yeah, we have the genres of books related to the trustworthy transmitters or credible transmitters. So, and then we have geobiographical dictionaries, etc. So basically applying those knowledge or those sciences, yeah, the science of ruwat, to determine or to criticalize, analyze the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yeah, to affirm the meeting or exploring the possibility of meeting between the informant and the recipient, to ensure that the chain is actually connected and not broken. And also the application of ilm jarh wa ta'dil to identify the status of the rawi, and examining all the transmitters in the sanad to determine, when it comes to jarh wa ta'dil, yeah, when we examine the ruwat, we examine the transmitters, we want to determine his or her credibility and also accurateness, and examining all the ruwat in the corroborative chains if necessary. So if there are other corroborative chains, we also examine those chains. So basically these are efforts which fall under the category of naqd of hadith, criticism, yeah, naqd al hadith. This we will do, inshallah, in our class on Wednesday, inshallah, whereby we will practice, whereby using keywords, we try to trace hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, this we will do, inshallah, in our virtual class on Wednesday, inshallah ta'ala. As for the proper way of citing hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, especially when you are perhaps writing an article, or if you would like to post hadith on social media, this is the ideal way of doing so. Yeah, firstly mentioning the companion who transmitted the hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah, so it is not necessary to quote the sanad in full. Yeah, So it suffices by mentioning the companion of the Prophet ﷺ who transmitted this hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. So in this case, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, reported that the messengers of Allah ﷺ observed, "He who believes in Allah and the last day does not harm his neighbor, and who believes in Allah and the last day shows hospitality to his guests, and who believes in Allah and the last day speaks good or remain silent." Yeah. So this hadith is recorded by Imam Muslim in his Sahih. So the way to quote or to cite this hadith is mentioning that it is compiled by Imam Muslim. Yeah. And then mention his compilation. In this case, Sahih Muslim. Yeah. And then mention, because Sahih Muslim is arranged into various books and various chapters. Yeah. Books here doesn't mean separate books, as we might understand, but in Sahih Muslim itself, he has made divisions. Yeah. So certain categories of hadith are being arranged into books and then chapters. Yeah. So in this case, it is the book of faith, Kitabul Iman, the chapter of what? Encouragement to one's neighbor and guest, and in brackets, the number of the hadith. Yeah, the number of the hadith. So this is the ideal way of quoting or citing hadith. There are various other ways of doing so. Some would suffice by mentioning the collection, for example, Sahih Muslim and the hadith number. And that is what I normally do, as you can see in the slides. Yeah, I normally suffice by mentioning the hadith collection and also the corresponding hadith number. Yeah, but ideally, if you want to cite the hadith in a much better way, it is recommended that you mention the compiler of the hadith, yeah, and then the compilation itself, the book where you can find the hadith in, and also under which chapter. Yeah, this will become clear, inshallah, when we look at practice through using truth, yeah, in when we are citing later. The main idea here is to provide, yeah, with the wasallam. As for hadith criticism, yeah, as for hadith criticism in general, so if criticism is the effort to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong, it began since the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah. So what was done then? So if one had any doubts, yeah, with any statements of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they could refer directly to him. Yeah, meant that it meant no more than going to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and verifying something he was reported to have said. Yeah. So this was a practice of some of the companions. If they were not convinced that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said or did something, they would straight go to him and seek clarification or seek verification. So hadith criticism began in its rudimentary form, in its basic form, during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is an example where the Imam Thalaba came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and said, "Muhammad, your messenger came to us and told us so and so." Then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam affirmed and said he told the truth. Yeah? So what was the Imam doing here? He was seeking verification. Did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say so and so, or did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam do so and so as reported by his messenger? Then the Prophet ﷺ either affirmed or then either denied if in the case that someone is misusing or misquoting him. So during the early period after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, Muslims were very careful actually in ascribing statements to the Prophet ﷺ, and they scrutinized them properly. Yeah. So we have various examples in history in which, for example, Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu was one of them. Not only during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, yeah, but even after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he normally would verify, is it true that what reached him did come from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So among the Sahaba, among the companions who were pioneers of hadith criticism, there were Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, Umar ibn Khattab, Ali, Aisha radiallahu anha, and also Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. So these were some of the companions who were pioneers, when it comes to hadith criticism. So basically there was a three-tiered approach, in hadith criticism, in early hadith criticism, after the demise of the Prophet sallallahu and basically after the fitnah which befell the ummah, as everyone would know. When we mention the fitnah here, it concerns the trial and tribulation as a result of the conflict between Ali and Muawiyah after the death of Uthman radiallahu anhu, which then gave birth to religio-theological conflicts in the ummah. So firstly, the first tier would be demanding a source or isnad for the report. So demanding an isnad for reports attributed to the Prophet ﷺ was an excellent first line of defense against inauthentic material entering Muslim discourse. So this was the first step, demanding for a source. Secondly, evaluating the reliability of that source. So identifying the individuals who constituted isnads, evaluating the reliability. So here again, applying the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil and al-murwat, and then determining if there were any risk that someone unreliable might also have played some part in transmitting the report. And thirdly, seeking corroboration for the hadith, looking for other hadith which supports that hadith, or other sanads which supports that hadith. So when it comes to corroboration, there is what is known as shahid, whereby the hadith is basically transmitted by a second companion, or the Prophet ﷺ said something similar or did something similar in a different occasion or on another occasion. Or we have what is known as mutaba'ah, where one transmitter corroborated the report related by another transmitter that they had, that they had both heard from a common source. So this is corroboration. Jonathan Brown, he basically also draws parallel to what journalists do these days. Basically, when they receive information, they would verify the source. Who's the source for such an information? Then they would evaluate the reliability of such a source. Then finally, they will also try to corroborate, between the information that they received and also information from other sources. So basically, the practice of a journalist these days, in a way, is similar to that which has been established in the science of hadith criticism, although we can argue that when it comes to hadith criticism, it is more serious and more analytical in nature. Why? Because here we are dealing with the sayings or actions of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is something very serious and cannot be taken lightly. So one of the most obvious characteristics of early hadith criticism is that early scholars almost never discussed the contents of hadith, let alone explicitly rejected a hadith because its meaning was unacceptable. So some would argue that the scholars focused on sanad criticism rather than Matn criticism. So a Muslim critic would not declare a report attributed to Muhammad SAW to be forgery simply because it describes something that average man could not know. So for example, one would not reject hadith just because the Prophet ﷺ mentioned something of the unseen, which cannot be comprehended by normal human beings. So early critics like Al-Bukhari and Muslim were willing and able to reject a hadith because they found its content inherently flawed. Having said that, there are early critics like Bukhari and Muslim who were willing and able to reject a hadith because they found its content inherently flawed. But then this is supported, when they look back at the sanad. A first glance at the Matn would then render that hadith to be rejected. But when they analyze the sanad, then it is confirmed that it is problematic and then renders the hadith to be rejected as well. So it was not, some would argue it was not just because of the Matn itself, which on the outset would deem it to be flawed or rejected outrightly, but further scrutiny of the sanad would also reveal that there is or there are problems with that hadith. So Sunni hadith, we must understand that Sunni hadith criticism emerged in the context of intense ideological struggle between Ahlul Hadith and the school of early Muslim rationalists known as Mu'tazilah. So there was this tension between Ahlul Hadith and Mu'tazilah in the course of our history, and that is the context in which hadith criticism or Sunni hadith criticism emerged. So it is argued then that it is not a man's right to question the revealed religion that the Prophet ﷺ brought and that was preserved from him through the isnad. So early Sunni hadith critics did note problems in the meaning of certain hadith. In their context, however, it is clear why they could not do so openly. So they would not openly reject hadith just on the basis of the flaws found in the Matn, but then they would also look into the sanad and then find problems in the sanad, and that would primarily be the reason for rejecting the hadith. So the whole purpose of the isnad was to guarantee that the Prophet ﷺ said something without relying on man's flawed reason. So this was the context in which hadith or Sunni hadith criticism emerged, and that is why it appears to be that Matn criticism was not the focus at that time. As for the methodology of hadith criticism, we also looked at this in brief just now, the three-tiered approach. But basically we can sum this up as the effort to compare or to cross-question or to cross-reference hadith to determine the veracity or the soundness of the hadith in question. So one would gather all related materials or all the hadiths concerned, comparing them carefully with each other in order to judge the accuracy of scholars. So one would then compare between hadith of different students of one scholar, of one scholar, not one scholars, of one scholar. So if there was one scholar or the main transmitter of the hadith, and then we have his students, so then they would compare between each students whether there are discrepancies between them, or comparison between the statement of a single scholar at different times. And this apparently was done even by Aisha radiallahu anha. After a certain time, she would then verify the same hadith again, and if the person transmit the hadith accurately as it is, then she would say, okay, this hadith is then sound because the person did transmit it without any changes as he did before. Comparison between oral recitation and written documents, this is another way, and also comparison between hadith and related Quranic text. And when it comes to this is where Matn criticism plays a larger role. But as we have seen in the context in which Sunni hadith criticism emerged, this was normally camouflaged also with sanad criticism. As for Orientalist and Hadith, since the late 1800s, the role of Hadith has grasped the attention of Orientalists who sought to identify the origins of Islam and its religious institutions. So the main thesis would be the issue of authenticity, whether the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which were recorded, which were compiled, by various hadith scholars, were they authentic? So the question of authenticity and authority was at the heart of their investigations. So there were two major leading scholars when it comes to Orientalists who analyzed or who had interest in hadith studies. There were, I'm not sure of how to pronounce their names, Goldziher and Shach, who basically subjected traditions to historical criticism. So there is what is known as HCM, historical criticism method, if I'm not mistaken, which were very much inspired by the development in critical textual studies and source criticism methods, which they applied to the Bible and other religious scriptures. They wanted to impose this upon Muslim scriptures as well. So they concluded that the contents of hadith contain evidence of much later periods and that the majority of traditions were falsely attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this was a conclusion made by the Orientalists. Yeah. And they also methodologically advocated a skeptical attitude toward the entire hadith literature. So they questioned the issue of isnad, the issue of why hadith was compiled much later compared to the Quran, etc., to cast doubt on hadith literature as a whole. Yeah. And this actually had a profound impact, not only on the West, but also on the East, where heated debates arose in response to the question of the authenticity of the whole corpus of hadith. Yeah. So basically, their conclusions actually shook not only, basically in the West, perhaps it was normal, but also some in the East were affected or impacted by such a conclusion, and that started, even among Muslims, that started questioning hadith of the Prophet sallallahu, and then that is why we have those which are known as Quraniyun, those who advocate that one should only refer to the Quran and not refer to the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu, because there is this issue of authenticity. Here again, the Occidental perspective of hadith criticism, the authenticity question, whereby Western scholars' critical examination of hadith and the methods that Muslims use to authenticate them can be seen as laudably advancing our understanding of Islamic origins as a part of a larger human endeavor to expand all areas of knowledge. So that was basically their claimed purpose. Yeah. So Western criticism of hadith tradition can be viewed as an act of domination, in which one worldview asserts its power over another by dictating the terms by which knowledge and truth are established. Yeah. So here, as we mentioned again, they wanted to impose, for example, the historical critical method or whatever method that they have developed, to analyze text also on Muslim text. Yeah. And here also comes the issue of epistemology, of how to know something, in which it differs. Our worldview sometimes collides, in this sense, to determine or how how do we know something, and how do we establish the truth. So Muslim hadith tradition and the Western academic study of Islamic origins represent diametrically opposed approaches to evaluating the authenticity of reports about the past. Yeah. So Sunni tradition of hadith criticism was founded on a commitment to sifting reliable from unreliable hadiths based on criteria that examine both the sources of a report and its contents. Yeah. So this was the approach, or this was basically the overarching objective of Sunni hadith criticism, sifting through the hadith, evaluating the hadith, and determining or differentiating between that which is unreliable. In the absence of conflicting evidence or some strong objection, Muslim hadith scholars and jurists treated a report attributed to Prophet ﷺ prima facie as something he really said. Yeah. So it is basically like the presumption of innocence, until proven guilty. So if there is no conflict, no evidence of conflict, or if there is no strong objection that it is indeed a saying or a practice of the Prophet ﷺ, then it is presumed to be from the Prophet ﷺ. However, the Western approach is opposite. Basically, the historical critical perspective towards the past means not accepting what historical sources tell us without question. So basically here, they are very skeptical of what has been reported from the past, and they apply this HCM, historical critical method, upon Islamic texts as well. And as we have mentioned just now, since we come from different worldviews, then surely one would not come to the same conclusion, because we believe that hadith has been preserved or have been preserved throughout time, and we have looked at this when we look at the verification of sanad, and also to an extent the verification of the Matn, yeah, and the efforts which have been put in by various scholars of hadith in this regard is proof that hadith of the Prophet ﷺ also has been preserved, yeah, yeah. We can then argue about how it is being interpreted and understood, etc. That is another issue. But the hadith literature itself, the hadith that we have at our disposal, yeah, that we can use in terms of trying to understand certain things, have that corpus of hadith, yeah, and believing it is from the Prophet ﷺ is a totally different issue from the way in which perhaps one could understand or then practicalize the principles found in those hadith. So those are two separate issues. Okay, so the main reference again which I use for this live lecture is Jonathan Brown's Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World. So I hope you have benefited a bit from this very brief lecture. So inshallah, when we meet on Wednesday morning, we will try to practice when it comes to Takhrij al-Hadith, and if we have any issues regarding the authenticity of hadith, yeah, or the authenticity question, perhaps we can probe this further, or we can discuss this further in our meeting on Wednesday morning, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, brothers and sisters, I think I'll stop here. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.